So cool. And so we can get started. The general structure for this is that we're just going to talk a little bit about at the beginning, sort of the intentions of what we're doing. Why are we looking, to cultivate things? Not that you need a specific reason, but, sort of clarifying our intentions with growing at home, growing whatever scale that we're thinking, the things that we are growing. So we'll kind of take a virtual walk through that. And I really encourage discussion throughout this all. If you have any questions, feel free through the chat, through the just like audio, whenever we get to a pause, we transition from different slides. And yeah, because I know that this is something that was really meant to be in person, and I really appreciate that in any sense when it comes to classes and interacting. And so sometimes it's a very interesting way to adjust it to be digital. So in whatever way, questions, anything, just feel free to shout. So cool. So we will start on the first slide and talk about the benefits, which I'm sure many of y'all are aware of, but I think is worth just reiterating, especially in these times. There are so many different benefits of home gardening, some of the most obvious being fresh food. Obviously, you are growing the freshest. You're not worrying about shipping something from across the world. You are on a seasonal basis. Our bodies are able to adapt and really become in sync with the environments around us. And so when we're growing with the seasons fresh, that really affects our health on a deeper level. Our choice of cleanliness of food, which is an interesting sentence I thought about when I typed that. Obviously, most of us want our food to be very clean. And I'm also referring to that and saying that we have the choice to determine that we don't want to use anything synthetic. We don't have to or have the desire to use anything that might interrupt or be bad for our health that we might see in conventional agriculture. So that's one obvious one. A choice to cultivate culturally relevant foods. And like I said, that's sort of my specialty with the work that I do. I focus on growing things from folks of the diaspora from all parts of the world. There's a very, especially within North Carolina in comparison to other places, Charlotte is a very diverse place. We have folks from all over the world. A lot of folks who do this on their own and cultivate their traditional foods. And so part of my work has been also to encourage sort of a introspective, process of looking at what are things that mean something to me. Am I just growing things for, a general diet, the food that I'm making? Or am I thinking, this is a traditional recipe that my grandmother used to make. I really want to be able to replicate that and do that on my own. While also preserving tradition and seeds and everything that comes along with that. And then another, obviously, is able to preserve and keep foods for kitchen use later or over winter. And so I'm not sure specifically with this this course with OGS, but I believe, or actually I don't believe, but maybe at some point there's some talk on preservation and getting things canned and stored for the winter. We are obviously working, like I said, with the freshest stuff when we're growing stuff ourselves. So we're able to really determine, do we want to, make pickles or ferments or dry things or can things? And that definitely, especially when folks are off the grid, and even that, you don't have to be living in the middle of the forest to can your own things and preserve food, but that helps in a financial sense. And also in a craft sort of DIY sense of being able to do those things and choose the flavors that you pick and what exactly you're creating. And so as a general thought, mentioned at the bottom, what are some of the reasons you choose to garden? What are some of the goals you have for and with your garden? Just as something to think about, and if you have any comments or ideas for that, feel free to mention them. Like I said, the difference between doing in-person stuff and digital, I feel like there's less conversation that sometimes happen. But if you've ever, be in a class with me, I'm very I want to talk about these things and interact. So like I said, if you want to leave those in the chat and we can talk about them as we go, I really am open to whatever, any input or questions or ideas you have, feel free. Cool. So we'll hit the next slide. So the way that I like to look at this, and I think there's obviously many other aspects, but I feel like sometimes this covers the general basis of things, is that there's 4 general elements of gardening. And we're using sort of the typical like 4 elements, whatever system that originates from, coming from earth, fire, and water and air, and the ways that those incorporate into the plants themselves, our personal lives, the environment, the materials that are needed. These elements basically represent everything involved with home gardening. And this would be to scale as well. It's considering the actual resources that we have, our financial position, the environment, the soil, the climate, everything and beyond. So we're going to start with Earth. So in starting with Earth, and I think that this is arguably probably the most important, because this is the makeup and the groundedness, the creation of what exactly we're doing. And also, sorry, meant to mention it earlier, but if you have, pen and paper, feel free. It's really great to write this stuff down, whether or not you want to talk about this with us on this class. But also keeping this for yourself. I really hope that this can sort of put ideas into your head and different concepts, and that way you can take notes for when you are planning out your garden now, into the next coming months, because it sounds like a lot of us are here on the East Coast, and so that season is definitely starting soon. It's still very cold, but generally it's starting to warm up. Seeds starting, which I know is the next class in this series, is also very important, starting to come up soon. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So with Earth, this is the element of stability and groundedness. This is our location, where our materials, right? Now, as I mentioned, I really like to focus on the fact that not everybody is at a level where we are growing something, for instance, like on a huge scale, acres or anything like that. Some of us might be home gardening in the sense that we want to have some plants in the windowsill. We want to have some things in pots on the front porch. We don't have a lot of space. We're in an apartment. And so it's really, I like to consider all of those different things and talk about the reality of that. So if any of you all, oh, did someone say something? I don't know, maybe that was a glitch up with the sound. But if any of you all have specific questions or thoughts about something that you're planning out, again, feel free to leave that in the chat. I really encourage conversation in that sense. So in a more physical and spiritual aspect of what Earth means for plants and for gardening, this is in the sense of the roots, stability with wind, etc. This is the stability and groundedness of our plants. We're focusing on the soil, the materials that we might use to cultivate. So soil considerations become one very important thing. We consider the health, what type of soil, and also the cost of our soil. So in starting with soil, we'll start with maybe 3 different things. We'll think of indoor growing, we'll think of outdoor in pots, so container gardening, and then we'll think of in the ground. And again, just because not everybody has access to every single one of these, I've been, in plenty of situations where my landlord's like, I want nothing in the ground, and even thought a potted plant was kind of a nuisance somewhere. So there's a lot of ways that we can adapt and still be able to cultivate these plants that feed us and bring us medicine. So with soil consideration, both with indoor and outdoor, one thing, if you are growing on a smaller scale, you might consider is getting bags of soil. You can find bags of soil usually at your local hardware store. Obviously, you can see things at like Lowe's, Home Depot. Sometimes there are more specialty stores. Sometimes there's also organic gardening markets. For instance, there's one, I think it's American Beauty Garden Center in Charlotte. I really love them, and I go there, and they have really great bags. The price range you might get sometimes might be around like sometimes $8 for really good quality soil. I don't always shoot for just like wanting to get super, super high quality, because I know over time, organic matter being added in, your plants adding the nutrients that they leave. It's, overall, it starts to really build your soil over time. So I don't always look for like the most expensive, most nice. And also, yeah, thank you, Abby, like Fifth Season, Reams Creek. So there's a lot of great resources out there, especially in Western North Carolina. If you are doing in smaller pots, then obviously you're focusing also on getting pots. You can get even biodegradable pots from certain places. If you ask a nursery, a community garden, a lot of times people usually have pots left over. I know at one point I was running a greenhouse, and every day I was just like, hey, if you want to come and take pots, please take them. We have a lot. So there's always an excess in a lot of places that might be willing to give you free pots or for really cheap. Um, if you are growing in the ground or in something like a raised bed, then you're basically, say if you're growing in the ground, you would be considering maybe getting soil testing done. You can usually do that with your local government. Sometimes there's an extension. I'm not sure the one specifically with Western North Carolina or other regions, but you can usually get a soil sample tested for pretty cheap, usually sending it in or even dropping it off if you're in an area where they're close by. And you can get a good feel on if your soil might have something that you might not want to be growing in. There might be something like, heavy metals. It might have been an area that was very polluted in the past. And that might not be the best place for your plants to be planted and really start to extract and pull up those compounds as well. There are many different plants, I would say, that pull things in general, but some absorb more than others that can take on heavy metals and whatnot. These plants are sometimes called bioaccumulators. So just keeping that in mind. If you are doing in the soil and you've tested and you feel very confident that it's clean and something great, then your next step would basically be to buy soil to amend it. In Charlotte, basically, we have what people call Carolina clay. And I'm sure that goes up into the mountains as well in certain regions. This is red, orange clay. Now, things do grow in this, but if we're growing a home garden, we're thinking, tomatoes and peppers and all sorts of things, the pH of the soil and other considerations may be a little off. So the general gist is that we are getting soil that we can add to add more organic matter, break it up, become more porous, not be so dense if we do have a clay-like structure. And even with sand, just adding more so that we have, not only adding soil to sand for like more bulkiness, but then adding soil to clay for a little less bulkiness, so it just depends on what you have. So if you're adding that in, you're tilling it in, you're moving the soil in. If you're growing in something like a raised bed, then your next step might be to look at going to a hardware store and getting some wood. You could also use spare scrap wood from somewhere. That can usually be a lot cheaper. The first time I ever made a garden, I had kind of like a transition thing where I was really into skateboarding when I was younger. And I had made like a little ledge that was basically like a wooden box that was for skating and I would do stuff on. And my idea was just, I was like, all right, well, I guess I don't want this anymore. And so I deconstructed it and I turned it into a garden bed. And basically just considering I needed a little like 2x4 with whatever size that you might do for your beds. They might be like 3 foot, each way or 4 feet by each way. And just getting some screws, screwing those in, and you basically have something set. You're just creating a container in general. If it really can't be in the soil, then you might also look into getting some sort of a netting or some material in order to separate it from the soil, because that soil will always grow back. If your landlord's like, what's happening with the grass under it, it dies back, but it will come back. And so that's just one thing to consider if you are doing in a raised bed. If you're doing pots, again, potting soil. You could also get organic soil or some sort of soil that might be better for the ground, but just putting it into pots. You don't necessarily need a potting blend, although sometimes they're designed with certain things like perlite in order to help with drainage and small container environments. So that's kind of the consideration. I, in personal experience, have been able to create 1 or 2 raised beds with some soil for a little less than $150. So it just depends on exactly, again, your resources. If you are growing somewhere and you want a bunch of soil, there are certain places like landscaping companies that have really great soil that they can bring in bulk. And if you're doing that, I really encourage maybe talking with your community members and organizing a collective purchase. You could, for instance, in the past, I've bought things that might be about $120. But because there's a fee, it's really the fee that hikes the price up because the company might deliver it in a dump truck. And so you can just, bring somebody's yard or driveway who's open to leaving it there. You put a tarp or 2 down and you get it dropped off, and everybody collectively puts an amount in that covers the cost and makes it cheaper for everybody. Because sometimes they don't really let you purchase in that scale unless it's at a certain amount. And then you are getting a discount, but you have to go so high up, you might not even need that much soil. So that's also something to consider for sure. So that's talking a little on soil, raised beds, pots, whatever your selection is. Location, where is your garden? So this is also another thing to consider. A lot of things I've heard from people when they ask about gardens is, well, I have, a forest in my backyard. And in that case, they don't really have much sun. They get very spotty sun. And so it's very important to consider the light that you might have, which we'll talk in another element about that. But just considering the elements, is it stable here long term? Are you trying to put something in the ground and you might not even be living there at the end of the year? Or are you growing somewhere where you know that you'll be there for a long time, and you can also plant things like perennials that are coming back every year, and that are really just going to be only growing better and better with time. And then also talking on materials. So are you building a box? Are you using pots? Again, like we had talked about. This is just considering all of everything involving the materials that come up with things, and what exactly you need to cultivate things. Along with this, obviously, comes your actual plants, your seeds, your plants, your amendments. Maybe you get worm castings and you want to add organic material to everything as you're growing. You might be adding scraps of certain things from a compost pile nearby and adding in there. So always just considering, what exactly is the makeup of your soil, and what are your intentions with that. So does anyone have any questions about this specific element, or comments or thoughts? Worm castings, yeah, worm castings is basically worm poop. And worm poop is very high in organic matter and a lot of nutrients for soil. And so a lot of like worm farmers will sell it, and basically you dilute it with water, which is usually called like worm casting tea. And that is usually applied to the soil. Some people will apply it directly to plants. But as we'll talk a little bit about with soil, there's a term that's called basically like if soil is too hot. And hot is meaning it's so much organic matter, it's actually a little too hard for plants or seeds actually to germinate or grow well in it. But that's just a organic fertilizer or applicant that's used in a lot of organic farming processes. Cool. So if y'all are good, oh, here, another one. What is the best resource for determining how to treat soil if soil test indicates need to? I would probably look into your local, the folks that you might have gotten it tested with. And in that sense, they might be able to help you do that. If you are growing in, or if you do have soil that might have like pollutants, like severe pollutants in it, then you might need to look into that, but it may take some time to do that. Even the natural process of soil and plants and everything sort of accumulating and dissipating of that might take years at a time. So you just want to consider, is that because there's something there? Is that because something was dumped there? I've heard stories of people trying to garden, and after they were like, weird, there's like pieces of like tin and stuff. There was like a whole car hood or something that was like 2 feet under there. So sometimes it really just depends, but I would say maybe referencing the center that did the soil testing and asking the best way for that specific compound to be dissipated and treated so that you can plant into that soil. Cool. So if there's no more questions, we can move on to the next one. Oh yeah, and also second from Levy, I think reaching out to the extension agencies can help you get, deficiencies, even if it's deficiencies, because sometimes it's not necessarily a fact that there's something that is terrible for you to be consuming. But if you are missing something, it's a different pH than you're wanting, then you might be looking to amend it with something like lime or some other material that, they can recommend to you. Cool. So the next one we have is water. Water, obviously, that's the element of nurture, of hydration. It feeds the plant life and the fauna around it. And also, obviously, the insects, the bugs, the mycelium, the fungi that are growing within the soil itself. This is obviously something very important because you want your plants to thrive. You can consider your exact area that you are growing in and what your weather is like. I know sometimes, obviously within these days, sometimes weather can be it can vary a lot. And so when we're thinking that we are going to be dependent on this many inches for this season, or a storm this day or whatever, sometimes there's more intensities of things that make it harder for us to really navigate that. There might be excess water, so there's flooding. There might be total lack of it, so we have drought for extended periods of time. I know in Charlotte specifically, we've had a lot of drought before. And so when it comes to farming, I've had to be sort of hyper aware of everything being able to adapt really well to that and how exactly irrigation works. So some things to consider about your garden space, your home garden, is where are your water sources? So do you have a hose that you're going to be able to tap into, or like a spigot from the house? Are you collecting rainwater off of the roof that you can tap into and irrigate from there? Are you coming with, is it manually watered with a hose whenever you get the chance? Do you have sort of like a tripod sprinkler set up with a timer even on it? That way you don't even have to go out to water things when you want to. There are really easy ways that you can get things established so that you don't even have to consider it. Or if you really want to be out there, which I know when I first started gardening, I really wanted to I wanted to water things. It was very satisfying to water everything. It was also kind of like an exploration, looking through things, seeing how everything's doing. And that's just, one role of tending. How is your drainage? So I'm sure some of y'all have been outside at some point and looked around in areas that are all the same of whatever, grass or some clay or something. It might pool up in one specific area. And so if you're seeing that, then you're understanding that drainage in that area is pretty poor, and also water is being directed to here. And this may be good in the sense that you're getting a lot of water brought into an area, but it might also flood things and make it harder for your cultivation. And then there are obviously many plants, for instance, plants that have what are considered or like what are considered wet feet. This might be things like taro or elephant ears, if you've seen them be growing ornamentally. Certain medicinal herbs, even like gotu kola, really appreciate that. And obviously, crops, things like water chestnuts, they love water. They love stagnant water, and not drainage in the sense that is going to leave it dry if there's no water, if it's no rain. And also, I know I said stagnant water, but I mean more like water that's held somewhere and then is also passed through and refilled and whatnot. Because obviously with stagnant water in gardens, we might have the issue of mosquitoes or attracting certain things. So we just want to be aware of that. So considering drainage, one really great way to do that or practice that, and also the next part of it, which is what is rain like, is going out during a storm, or just focusing and looking out the window at the space that you do want to do that while it's raining. This can also help not only with water, but other things like wind. If there's a storm coming through, oops, sorry. I don't know if I just went out, my battery started getting low. But if there's a storm coming through or something, then you can understand where the wind is going. Is something I'm going to plant there that gets tall going to snap and get blown over? Is a flood going to come through there and just really mess with the roots, because that water content is just going to move all that soil off the surface, and then you're going to have to worry about exposed roots. Emily said, if using a rainwater catchment system, do you suggest filtering the rainwater, or can you use it directly from the barrel? I would say it depends on your specific situation. Some folks might have certain chemicals or a certain type of, what's the word I'm looking for? Shingles of their house. And so if they're catching from up there, you just want to be aware if there's anything that are in the shingles. And if it is getting certain things, then I personally have used it before and not had to worry about straining it or filtering it or anything, because usually it's just organic matter like leaves and stuff. But if you are getting certain things that like trash or even other sort of pollutants, then you might want to strain it if that is necessary. And then Kevin said, I use water collected from roof and a rain barrel for landscaping, but don't use for gardens because of chemicals and bitumen shingles on house. Yeah, I'm planning to install a metal roof on next home, so this is not an issue. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. That is definitely an issue when you are collecting water, in that sense that you're just getting a lot of these chemicals and compounds from shingles and the roofing. So aside from observing and seeing rainwater, drainage, pooling, etc., another thing is the consideration of water in our plants in our garden is plant hydration and its ability to maintain. All plants are different. All plants want certain amounts of water. Some want very little water. Some are fine after a prolonged period of time without it. Some need it very frequently. There's also a time issue and a consideration to think if you have a small plant start that's been put in the ground, it might not have the roots established to really endure a lot of rain. in comparison to something that might be bigger and is bushing out a little more and is more established to really take a lot of rain. So also considering the types of plant we're growing, I've grown succulent plants. For instance, a plant called African oregano or oregano brujo is a really plant that I'm very fond of and I like to cultivate. It's very, very succulent. And so when it does rain and it gets that, it really doesn't need it for much longer. I usually had, in my cultivation of that specific succulent plant, I had gone a week and a half, 2 weeks with no watering. And it was just a very succulent, water absorbing plant that did really well in drought. And another consideration with water, where's the water going? Again, when we see that pooling up, is that a place that we maybe do want to grow something? Are we trying to grow things that love flooded areas? I've seen plenty of people even on smaller scales doing things like growing rice. And so you're basically using flooded areas. I've also grown water loving crops in, I kid you not, a kiddie pool. And you get a kiddie pool and you flood it and you add some soil and you can grow rice, you can grow taro, all sorts of things. So being considering where exactly the water is going specifically is also a really great thing to keep in mind. So this is all just a little bit on water. I hope that helps us understand. Again, recapping, we're thinking of where's our water coming from, where's the water going, what is our weather like? Are we growing in an area where we don't even get water in the form of rain at all? Are we in a place in the Southwest that really doesn't get a ton of water, and we're introducing and trying to grow plants that really need water on a regular basis? Financially, is it feasible to be using that much water? Or are we looking into maybe trying to get some sort of rainwater catching system in better? So any questions or comments about water? I appreciate the comments and questions about the roofing and the water catchment. It's very important. So Cheryl said, I'm looking to replace my irrigation system, suggest sprinkler or soaker hoses. It really just depends. I would say if you're doing something like a sprinkler, then you just want to make sure it's broad enough to really catch everything and whatever extension or way that you're setting it up. So that's one thing to consider. If you are doing like drip or, just like low to the ground, that's always good too. Some plants, I feel like I like to just cover them all in water. And the only thing with doing it low like that is that you're just getting in the roots. So it's really up to you. I would say only thing I think of is there's more range and I have less wiring or sort of material to use if I'm just putting sprinklers set up. And sometimes you might have to have it on a little longer than usual because you need it to really coat everything in comparison to just each plant getting a little bit of drip. So up to your preference. My personal, I feel like is sprinklers. And because it's when it's really hot outside, I can just like walk into it and cool myself down. How can you protect seedlings from heavy rain? I think, I'm not sure if there's like a specific way that I know of. If anyone else has any ideas or things that have worked for you, feel free to comment. In terms of protecting them, I feel like my main thing is when I put something in the ground, I might give it a little more of a mound up of the soil around it, just to consider that if a lot of it washes off, then it might be an issue. Sometimes it's not even a lot of like water running by. It's just that the raindrops are like heavy and it's splashing around and moving the soil. So maybe mounding and also just considering sort of a protective space for it, whether a trellis to really hold it up, but just making sure that your roots are well established into the soil. And then Olivia said, this year I just used a watering can in my little plot, but I also failed at growing kale and spinach. So I'll probably be getting a sprayer attached to my hose. Nice. Yeah, if the sprayer works better, that way you can just sort of coat it all. I think it's really different in terms of when you are watering or you're just spraying it. Sometimes the pressure can be a lot and the plants are kind of like, all right, like getting pushed to the side. So yeah, and you learn by experience, as you notice that, and now you feel like, okay, I'll just get a sprayer. So Jake said, what are some common signs of stress for too much versus too little water for outdoor plants? Well, I think depending on what the plant is, if it is something that loves water or not, then you can kind of go by the traits that you have from there. In general, I have seen, for the most part, if you're getting too little or you're just getting a lot of heat, one of the main things you will notice, obviously, is yellowing leaves. Leaves will start to die off and lose their color. One also main thing is that they start to droop, depending on the stem system of something. that might not be the case. Peppers, for instance, might not really droop. They might just lose their leaves because they're a little more twiggy in their structure when they're pretty small. Overwatering, I feel like I would sometimes notice the same thing, like yellowing of the leaves. Sometimes the soil is a really good sort of tester, like um, sort of just physically understanding, like, is it damp? Does it feel very moist? You will have things like, I've had people ask me, like, why are there mushrooms coming up in my soil? It's because, it's okay. Like, that's part of a fungal like network in the soil that just like sends things up sometimes. But if you have it in excess and it's in areas where it's really starting to just be damp and wet all the time, that might be another sign that there's too much water for a specific thing. But in general, you will notice because your plant will not look in its prime, whether that is through color loss, leaf loss, falling over. I think a lot of it is a very visual thing to understand. Like, okay, my plant needs something for sure, And all plants are different, so sometimes they'll all wilt, and one of them will wilt because they're getting watered too much. The other one will wilt because they need water. So, cool. Any more questions? If not, we will move on to the third. Avi said, yes, I've also noticed similar symptoms with over and underwatering. Cool, definitely. So our third one, next one we have is air. So with air, this is the element of space, fluidity, movement. Wind is one of the main things when I think about air. Compatibility of location. So this taps into a little bit about the earth too. But in air in general, we are considering our movement and our space. One thing that can definitely happen is you can have a lot of lack of air movement within a garden, and then you start to risk getting certain mildews and molds on certain plants starting to wilt because they're not getting a lot of attention. One of them, well, not attention, but wind flow and air flow. One of my experiences with that has been growing hibiscus, and I would have hibiscus doing well, and then suddenly the leaves, also hibiscus is in the mallow family, so it's a very slimy thing. It's related to okra. It has very slimy leaves, the calyxes, which is the flower bud that are underneath the flower that's used for making tea. So when I've grown that and it's frozen, it's actually gotten very slimy after it defrosts. So when it molds and starts to break down because of a mildew or something, it would actually get very slimy too. So I would notice that and be like, why is that the case? And it was always the plants that were really submerged within a lot of different plants around it. As a perennial in tropical places, hibiscus gets very, very tall. It can grow like 8, 9 feet. As an annual in northern climates, usually not so much. I've had hibiscus get about 6 or 7 feet, so a little less, but they don't bush out nearly as much. They don't get as tall. So considering that, if they're compact in a small space, I was noticing that I was having an issue because of that lack of airflow with that. Another concept to notice or think about that I've had experience with air or wind was a garden that I was working in on the east side of Charlotte for a couple of years. And in this specific spot, there was sort of an opening through the into like a parking lot, and then it came sort of diagonal into the garden and then out to more airflow where it was open over there. Everything else, there was a mulberry tree there. It was really, really big. There was a lot of sort of lack of air movement. So the mulberry tree would catch a lot of the wind. And that could have been an indicator I thought of. But what I did in that open spot in the middle one year was I grew corn. I grew a corn from Mexico, and I had never, or I think it was like the second time I grew it, and it was huge. It was like 9, 10 feet tall. It started flowering. It started making its ears and like getting pollinated and whatnot. And so I knew that it was coming, and I don't remember what hurricane it was that we had. I think it was Hurricane Florence. And that pocket of where the wind flow came from there, because I would notice it as I saw the mulberry tree moving and I would feel the wind. That pocket with the hurricane just whipped everything down. All of the corn was snapped, it was broken. All of those things were just tore up. So that was something that made me aware of the fact that there is a pattern of wind movement in the area that I'm cultivating in. And to be more mindful of that. In the future, when I was cultivating there, we grew yucca bushes, which got very tall, but they bushed out. And so the bushy foliage combined with some of the lower growing plants around it was almost a windbreak as the couple rows of that broke it down so that the rest of that plot really didn't get much issue with wind. Or if anything, the wind moved above it, through and above it. And so I was sort of sending the wind to a different area in order to not be throwing all my stuff around. So that's just one way to consider air or wind as an element in our garden. Along with earth, I think with air, we think of our space. So long-term presence, again, is this a specific place we're able to cultivate for a while? What are the logistics of us growing in it? Is it something that we're able to plant and have a consistent future with, like perennials, or are we just doing annuals for just the season? And just like water, I think another thing about this that's important is observing movement in storms, everyday wind, and weather. Just looking outside, just being in it, just feeling it, right? Understanding where exactly are we in general, where's the movement, and again, are we in a space where there's a lot of wind? Can we cancel that out, plant differently? Or is it somewhere that's going to be very harmonious and help with airflow in our garden? Cool. And every part of the garden is completely different. We have obviously pockets of it where there might be just herbs or might be taller things. Every area of space and land is oriented differently with how it receives wind and the elements. So something to consider. Any questions about air, comments, thoughts, ideas? Growing things as a windbreak is a lot of people do, especially ornamentally. I've seen a lot of places where folks will put certain bushes or things that are very sturdy and very rigid in their branch structure and not very they won't really crack or anything. One thing I really see like that, especially within Charlotte or in the East Coast, is holly bushes. Holly bushes can get very tall, but they can also get wide and they're very stable. So they really don't, there's no issue in it really getting knocked over, and it catches and disperses wind very easily. Cool. So if there's no comments or questions or anything about that. Oh, I suspect air movement is required for effective pollination from Kevin. Yeah, definitely. Depending on whether exactly you're providing and pollination is based on insects, is it winds pollination as well? Then it can also help with the actual pollination of different things for sure. Thanks for mentioning that. Jake said, I remember when I was growing starts indoor, at first artificial wind flow was introduced to strengthen the stems. That's another thing, yeah. So the element of wind is not necessarily something that we want to protect everything from and not give any sort of hardship of some sort to the plants to endure. But in another sense, that's also a really great way to help build, strengthen the roots and also establish the stems and the structure of the plant to be more resilient. So yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, just simulating that with that. Another way that that's done, which I'll talk a little about, is the concept of zero irrigation, or very low watering, because we are wanting to get our plants to adapt to, obviously, if we're introducing water, that's not something that's going on exactly in our environment at that time. It's not actually raining. So adapting things into an environment, a lot of times like landrace varieties or heirlooms specific to a specific region grow best in that region because they're very adapted to the cycles, because they are like anything else, like a native plant. They really don't need tending. They're very in tune with the natural cycles, the rain, the lack of, and so sometimes not watering even when the plant might need it, just like with the wind, like you're saying, is a really great way to help build resilience, even genetically, into your plants, so that your seeds from the next generation are a little more tolerant of droughts, a lot of wind, anything like that. Cool. So we'll move on to our last element. So last we have the heat, fire, right? Warmth, sunlight, on a physical, tangible sense. Sunlight. So fire is the elements of sustenance and life. This is obviously what is responsible for our plants producing chlorophyll, is responsible for our plants growing in general. The sun and light is very, very important. UV rays affect our plants in a very nurturing way. In some cases, you're also able to replicate that through certain lights indoors. But if you are growing in the sense that you're able to, have a good amount of sunlight, 8 hours, roughly, is really great to just provide general light, even if just ambient, but also to direct sun is a really great way to do that. So this is our sunlight, our openness to space. Again, when people ask, they say, I don't really know if I can grow stuff. I have tons of trees back here. Just considering and understanding your directions. So understanding that when something, if it's rising in the east and setting in the west, as it comes up, where exactly are you at? Sometimes in neighborhoods and urban settings, it can be a little harder because you have houses that also block your light. So sometimes you're stuck between houses and trees, and you get a little pocket of time where you're getting sunlight over. And so that might be something you have to address by growing things in the front. You also would be considering, if you were growing on the porch or even in the windowsill, your window actually has access to light on a regular basis and warmth can come in. That way there are certain things that are able to thrive and really be produced through sun, even if it is indoors. Another aspect of fire or warmth is soil permeability from heat and dryness. After a while, this is just the general concept of how flooding happens, especially we see this on the West Coast when they don't get rain for a really long time. And after a while, the soil is just sort of drying up, becoming very stiff. It's sort of harder in its sense where when it finally rains, it's not as porous and absorbent of the water. It rolls right off, and then there's flooding. So at certain points, that might also be an issue because your water may not be able to, efficiently be absorbed into the soil. Your plants may not be able to take it in. So something to consider. But in general, you just want to focus on this being the warmth and the light that your plants are able to receive on a regular basis, about 8 hours or so, 6 to 8. Some plants are partial sun, so they want maybe less, 5, 6 hours. And then sometimes if you're growing native plants and growing them in areas, which I really advise folks when they're considering having shaded areas, obviously some of these like typical home gardening things like fruits and veggies might not be super adapted to it, but if you're growing native plants that are growing in the forest, then they might do really well there, depending on how the soil is as well. So that's definitely one thing to keep in mind with sun too, and also where exactly you are in the cities. For instance, in more urban areas, you can see that the heat that's generated because of concrete, buildings, everything is a lot more intense. It might not even be that hot, but in the middle of the city, it's very hot. Likewise, if you're growing something near a lot of concrete, some folks even will grow things near the house if they want them to overwinter or come back the next season, if it's sort of hard for them to do that. One example, because of the warmth that comes off of the house and the brick and the material as it absorbs and gets heat from the sun. One example was I used to live at a house and we would plant lemongrass along the house in a bed that was basically almost on the wall, because that heat and those bricks that sort of created that heat over time, even in the winter, would keep the roots from not necessarily freezing but coming back. So we would use the house warmth for some of those perennials, like perennial herbs, things like that, lemongrass especially. So cool. Any questions, considerations, ideas, thoughts about this element? Fire, heat, warmth. Again, if you're inside, you're looking. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Brendan. Finish.
I was just saying, if you're inside, just considering the the windowsills, and that is also bringing a lot of warmth in, and that you're able to really attract more energy through that. Like rough example, which I feel like I'm on my front camera. So like that plant over there, the passion flower against the wall, does really, really well because it takes a lot of that sun from or that light from the sun that comes through that window every morning.
Yeah, and indoors definitely like supplementing with, if you're gonna be starting your own starts and you're doing that in your house and not a greenhouse, supplementing that with lights.
Yeah,
I was gonna mention also, this is sort of like a topic for a whole class could be taught on this, but thinking about also layering in your garden. If you do have trees or fruit trees that are part of your sort of like garden dream, trying to find things that would grow well with different amounts of light. And that's, something that's very present in, ancient cultures that have cultivated forever in the forest. And being able to, grow different types of foods and herbs and medicines at different layers. So you're not just stuck having everything at one level and with one amount of sun. But there's lots of resources on the internet about that too. Yeah, multi-level gardening.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, looking at the advantages that we have from space above, space not only just like wide space in terms of feet or spread out, but also above, and also considering, yeah, what a lot of some people call, and more in a modern sense, is called like polycultures, which we'll talk a little about in one of the slides, and like how exactly plants um, can also complement each other when they are growing, in a way where they're not necessarily just like on their own, but they're working with other plants, and sort of levels to it, like a ground cover and a small herb and a bush and then a tree. So definitely. So we can switch to our next one. Sorry, I'm going to take these headphones out and I'm actually going to put the charger in, but I'm just going to make sure that I can still be heard well. So hoping y'all can hear me good on this. So cool. So we'll switch to the next one. If there's no comments or questions about heat, fire, warmth. Yeah, so that's sort of the culmination of everything in general. We have all of our elements, we have all the considerations to what exactly it takes on an elemental sort of sense, and with the elements, the rain, the water, our soil, financially looking at it, logistically looking at it. I'm not sure if there's anything that I may not have covered, that any questions you all have or comments about these considerations. And feel free, we can make the open discussion about that a little bit. If y'all have any questions specific about that, any like observations you might have had about your specific land and how exactly that grows, and considering, the elements at play or the elements that might be, needed to be attended to in certain ways. Let's see. Kevin said, thinking about greenhouse. I have a slide on that and talking about like inside warmer spaces. So maybe we can talk a little about that when we get there. The considerations, yeah, I will definitely go over that. Becky said, for overwintering or warmth by a building, is a particular side of a building best warmer? Yeah, I feel like south, I'm trying to think. Terrible with my directions sometimes, especially with this. I forgot, I thought it was a southwest or a south, yeah. West facing, yeah, that way you're getting a good amount of sun depending on your actual position, what you're facing around you. Yeah, Kevin, west, thank you. Hottest side of the house, perfect. Southwest, nice. Emily said, are you going to talk about crop rotation? I always struggle with transitions between spring, fall, summer, and fall seasons. Yeah, we can talk about it a little bit as we go. I'm not sure if there might be other talk about that in some of the other classes, but we can talk a little bit about the concept as we get into maybe one of the next slides about the concept of polycultures and not on like a monoculture sense, not growing rows. Kevin said, I grow roses all year on that side because of brick radiating heat. Nice. Yeah, so that's kind of how I was referring to with like the lemongrass. You're able to tap into the warmth that naturally comes from that aspect, that part of the building being warmer, and also the light that you are, yeah, directing in that area. Cool. And Kevin said you live in Charlotte, not in the mountains. Yeah, so it really just depends, because you know how it is in Charlotte. In Charlotte, it gets a lot hotter. You can really, there's really a sort of culmination of heat in a different way than in the mountains. And I feel like it's also considered that Charlotte's pretty green, but definitely not if you were living up in the mountains and you had sort of a coolness because of the foliage and a breeze. And depending on elevation too, it's a lot different in Western North Carolina. So yeah. So we can switch to the next slide. So this is just a really good example, I feel like, something that we can talk about, and a concept that's really great to remember and understand, that our ancestors did not grow monocultures. So for reference, and monocultures, I feel like most of us have seen before, especially in the South, especially in the Carolinas. Monocultures are, as you're driving by, you see those fields and fields of soy, corn, tobacco, fill in the blank, commodity crops that grow in excess in a lot of places for acres and acres and acres. And so monocultures, basically their detriment of that is that they are growing in a sense that there is this human sort of idealized concept that this is what grows, nothing else does, no weeds, no pests, quote unquote, no insects, no anything to consume anything. This is ours, you know. And so really looking at and considering the natural world to be something that can be sort of established and dictated on what exactly it does, which is unnatural. And so looking back historically, obviously, all cultures have really never done that. And a lot of times, integrated farming into the forest regions has been a very specific way on how exactly that has happened in a way that makes sense. Certain methods, like specifically in a lot of tropical regions, what folks now call slash and burn, which is where organic matter is brought into from burning green foliage and also bringing that back into the soil in order to cultivate things on an annual and semi perennial scale. So your garden really does not need to be rows, you know. When we look at this example, for instance, in the photo, we have this is something called, and depends on where exactly you are, but usually called Three Sisters. The Three Sisters farming method in general is corn, squash, and beans. This is an indigenous practice that has its roots all throughout the Americas, with corn, squash, and beans all originating from this region and from this continent. And so basically through the process, what happens is you have your corn, right? Your corn grows, it sprouts, it starts to come up, your corn gets very tall. You have your squash, we can see on the bottom, and the squash starts to spread out. And sometimes with the big leaf foliage of the squash, you're able to maintain moisture, you're able to shade the soil so that, you know, water retention is better, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have beans, which are planted into the soil, and they use the corn as a trellis or as a growth source, or as a not growth source is the word I'm looking for, as a source of something to crawl up, and grow up them at the same time. The different amounts of nutrients and compounds put into the soil, like nitrogen from the beans, helps things grow better, and all the other specific types have their own purpose for how they're helping the synergistic planting. This also, on a nutritional sense, provides starch and bulkiness in the form of and nutrients, and generally a full meal as squash, corn, and beans. This is a general sense of it, but what happens in a lot of places, like parts of, of Central America, is something that's called a milpa. So this is basically a first stage of a milpa. And so here that says calabaza, so like squash, chile, so spicy peppers. Quelites are basically like an edible green. And so the basis from this all is that you can see on the right, on the bottom right, they have chile peppers growing. So you have spicy peppers. You have things planted throughout, and you're basically creating an environment where weed growth to some extent is not even really rampant because it is saturated with the space of all of the other plants that are growing really well, whether peppers, tomatoes, root crops, corn, beans, squash, greens, anything like that. And together, this makes a really amazing situation. And also, if some of y'all have seen before, you can see in the top right of the diagram, it's talking about a fungus that grows sometimes on the corn called huilacoche. And that is a fungus that's used in culinary applications, medicine. You can find it if your corn does get the fungus, and a lot of times in conventional agriculture and large industrial scale farming, it's considered a pest and it's killed off, or just like eliminated, discarded. But that's another concept of this specific like Mexican style milpa. And in the long term of a milpa, or this traditional growing process, this annual sense of corn, squash, beans, peppers, uh, greens, whatever else is growing. And as you continue, smaller plants are being established, trees, bushes. Eventually, you're building sort of like a perennial like bush and tree area. Over time, you planting trees. The trees get bigger, 10, 15 years. They shade out this area so it cannot be used for annual cultivation like fruits and veggies. And at that point, there is medicine and fruit from the trees, their fruits, um, eventually establishing a forest. So in comparison to something that's just an annual scale, Milpas are usually for years and years at a time. That is how forests establish themselves. And once they get to that point, then again, the slash and burn process goes, those nutrients are added back into the soil and it happens over again. It's not really happened in the sense that the same place is just like grown, burned, and grown and burned, but it usually moves place to place just depending on the situation. So that is one really great example of this. And touching into what we were talking about earlier, like especially with polycultures and looking at how, as a monoculture of one crop, we lose biodiversity, we use natural wildlife, and understanding that as monocultures have tried to dictate it, uh, it is not just that these crops are for people. In a healthy environment, your crops and your food are food for other beings that exist, whether insect, whether fungal, whether animal. It's a good sign that that's happening because that is how plants grow in the wild and how exactly they are to interact with their environment, not just for one specific person or entity, but for nature as a whole. Um, so this is just sort of an example of that. Really awesome. I like this specific illustration a lot. Again, three sisters, milpas, another one. No-till is another process of cultivating in a way that might make more sense for long-term and also for soil health. When we're tilling, we're digging up the soil, we're integrating it up, especially if we're adding soil, if we're just resetting it for the next season. But what this does over time is sometimes it can eliminate a lot of good, healthy, like biological matter or just organic matter. And over time, it can also compact the soil and just not be the best for overall soil health in the end. So what no-till is that we're not compacting the soil, we're not tilling and opening any of that up. We're adding organic material and layering in. Our plant material is dying down, absorbing into the soil, being broken into. There might be like a little bit of till in terms of just opening up space with a shovel for planting, but for the most part, you're layering in. A lot of people in urban areas might do this with like cardboard, newspaper, and different materials, and they're able to actually establish something that's really well nurtured, is rich in nutrients, and is also not necessarily, you're only feeding the organic matter and the life that is in the soil. And another example of some of this is again, no irrigation. Though there were plenty of established and high tech like indigenous methods of watering and irrigation, not always is it necessarily needed. A lot of plants are very well established with the regions that they're native to. And so if you do have something that might be a variety from a specific area, it might be more acclimated to that. There might be an Eastern adapted, or some people say Northern adapted, which is something that might come from, for instance, a tropical or subtropical plant. Um, One way that I've seen that is, for instance, gandules. So gandules or pigeon peas are a very important crop in Puerto Rico and throughout the Caribbean and Africa and India. Um, and this specific I've grown before, but I've heard from people growing it, they say I can never get it to flower, I can never get it to go to seed because it's not necessarily adapted through selective breeding by different places, or also just varieties that have been grown for long periods of time in these northern areas. They don't have enough sunlight, long enough days to flower or set fruit. And so at that point, they just grow foliage and then they die back in the winter. But over time, with breeding, that happens extensively, you end up having varieties that are more adapted to regions, the weather, the heat, the actual length of day in order to really produce something. So that's also one thing to consider. Um, and yeah, and with polycultures, again, some of the many benefits aside from just providing more biodiversity, nurturing the soil is again in terms of wind and in terms of the movement of that. You're not necessarily you have a density of stuff, but you're not really needing to worry about stagnancy. You when it comes to also the sun, we're able to vary in how certain things need sun and certain things don't. Under the shade of the corn, certain things that don't do tons of sun might do really well, and vice versa, depending on other stuff that we're planting too. So I hope that helps. I really like this diagram, and this is a really great method of cultivating in general. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts?
I just wanted to say I feel like the way you described the progression of meal buzz can also be helpful in terms of thinking more long term about, especially for those of us who are growing in a space that we expect to be in for a long time. What do you want that space to look like this year versus, in 5 years versus in 10 years? If you want to start growing a tree, takes a few years at least before it starts producing fruit. So are
Yeah,
there, things you want to start investing in now, that and allowing them time to like grow in? Um, and yeah, I feel like that long-term vision is can be really helpful for reflecting too in terms of what we want to grow now. And yeah, I would say this is more, I guess, what was I going to say about this? This is an example of intercropping, but we can learn a lot from like the Three Sisters or from Milpa's about um, succession. I don't know who was talking about that. Um, Crop rotation and successive plantings, because just looking at, okay, what did this one plant need during its season? For example, a heavy feeder like tomato, you're not going to want to, that's not a great example because tomatoes do grow for a long while, but you're not going to want to plant another heavy feeder after that. So looking at the ways that these plants complement each other in the moment, but we can also learn about how, regeneration of the soil through nitrogen fixing plants like beans can be a really great thing to grow in a space where you just grew a really heavy feeder. I'm sure, Brandon, you'll have other thoughts on that as we go along.
totally. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that's one thing also to consider because our plants are establishing and depositing and also taking nutrients from the soil. And so if we're reiterating that process and taking the same thing, adding the same thing over and over, it's going to start to mess with the equilibrium of our soil. And also, thank you for mentioning that about the crop rotations, because I think this is kind of a good place to talk about that. And so, yeah, in this specific model, you can see that this is sort of looking at where this is originally done is usually within tropical to subtropical areas in terms of continuing into a forest, but it can obviously be done in actual temperate climates like up north too. And so if we're doing that, well, we might consider maybe take out the turning it into a forest, but looking at maybe annual cultivation for a certain amount of time. We might consider that our corn, once it makes its ears and comes down, can sometimes last pretty well into the season. So maybe if our corn is growing in a way where there's a couple rows and they're a little separate, that area might not really be something that is going to be grown into until the corn is totally done. It's chopped, it's moved up, moved all, and dissipated into the soil. And then at that point, we might be establishing some of our winter crops into that place. There are other plants that might have an even longer period of time. And this sometimes was the thing that I would go through, and it was not even a sense of an error, but it was more just a preference and a I guess sort of a internal battle because I would grow these crops that were tropical, subtropical, and they would need as much time as possible. And so in the areas where I did that, I would have a hard time with determining what I was going to be growing for the winter because I didn't even have time to get it into the soil to establish itself in late summer. But if you have something that's producing fruit or some sort of food into the late summer and then ending there, maybe a squash might do that and finish up its cycle if you plant it in spring for a summer squash. That might be something that can come out of the ground and then it can be worked and also planted for something that does need some of that warmth, maybe like cabbage or some sort of brassica, before it gets really, really cold. Because the issue that you do have is that if you are putting something in closer to them and it's not matured enough or established, it might have a hard time with that frost. Especially something like a brassica, which is usually adapted well, but you don't want to put it through too much. Or you also don't want to cut it too early and get too much heat because then you worry about some of your winter crops bolting, which is going up, flowering, going to seed, and then you don't really get any foliage or material to work with. Um, so I would say when it comes to crop rotations, I would just consider when you are planting something, when exactly is this going to be harvested and finished up? And then looking at what am I wanting to plant for the next season? When exactly can that go in? Usually by the time you're in summer, you're probably starting some seeds for winter. If you are wanting to switch to the next season, that way after 30, whatever, 60 days or something, you have really well established plants. By the time, if it's June or July, you're doing that, late September or something, you're able to put things right into the ground. And yeah, thank you. Seed packets will have good information on that. They'll talk about the amount of days that's needed. They'll also talk about the best time that you can really put something into the ground in order to get something that is, adapted well into your environment. And also look into the specific place that you are in, where exactly your season is considered to end, your first frost, etc. So Emily said, any suggestions on creative, sustainable watering solutions when planting using polycultures? I use a companion plant and not in rows necessarily, but don't prefer using sprinklers since I'm in raised beds. Irrigation hose is hard too since I'm not planting in rows, more square foot gardening kind of method. Yeah, I would say when it comes to watering with polycultures, one of the main things that's really great with that is that you get a lot more better water retention and moisture retention with polycultures, especially when you have your ground cover holding things in, smaller plants around that. So sometimes I've noticed personally that with polycultures, it's less watering you have to do. Creative and sustainable, I would honestly say that I'm sure there's plenty of different ideas and things that you could do. But my main thing that I've personally noticed is that I feel less inclined to need to water because they establish themselves a lot better, and are a lot more tolerant of drought or lack of water, once they are growing really well with each other. So I would say maybe it's up to you in terms of how exactly you're wanting to plant. But as a polyculture goes, maybe just water it at the base of it all as you would, and that way that it can sort of spread as needed. The plants can intake it in that way. um, if you're not using sprinklers because you're in raised beds, then yeah, maybe just irrigation hose throughout it and those roots will extend in. The thing with polycultures also is because you have so many different types of plants, water can be sort of absorbed in different ways. You might have something with tap roots, something with sprawling roots out, you might have something with very short roots, and you're able to be in an area where you're adding water and everything can absorb that water and retain it in the way that sort of works best for it. Hope that makes sense. Any more questions on any of this? Yeah, definitely. If not, then we can move into the next slide. So this is a consideration I really like. I really encourage people to think about, in general. Seed to plate. This is just a concept of considering, how obviously these foods that we're growing, the process does not end at like we're cultivating it and that's that. But we're considering, how exactly do we utilize these plants, in the way that makes sense for us? Are we canning, preserving? Are we cooking immediately? Are we using traditional recipes? The benefit and the gift that comes with cultivating foods is that we are able to preserve stories, recipes through gardening. I don't know about y'all, but I love to cook. I love to preserve different things. I like to write recipes, and also follow recipes and learn about them. Culturally, all over the world, recipes are a part of something deeper. They're a tradition, right? Food is intimately intertwined with ways of life, culture, tradition. And so it's something that can really help you to not only just connect with your body, but also connect with yourself and your personal history and your lineage. And so I really encourage people to do that. So considering also going back into what exactly we want to be growing, what are some of the things that might be relevant for us to be growing for ourselves? If any of y'all have ideas or any thoughts, feel free to reach out. I'd like to hear what some of the stuff that you all maybe for this season are thinking about planting, or things that maybe you would really like to plant, like you aspire to plant but not sure if it works. Because that's how I started. For me, I was like, I would love to plant, culantro or recao, which is a very popular Puerto Rican herb, and I just never seen anybody really plant it. And then I tried it and I got some seeds and I started to grow it and I started to make some of the same stuff that my grandmother made. And so through that process, there's a deeper level of reconnection because I'm also considering that plants not just to be like what I'm watering and tending to, but its own sort of, representation of my identity and also the ways that I connect with the food and my process of gardening in general. And another thing to consider about this all is, through that, there is preservation and story and knowledge within the seeds that we have as well. So where are we trading and receiving seeds starts from, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. Just considering that, are we within a community that we're able to swap with? Are people, do people have some? Are we able to just buy them online? Do we have our own small seed library, which is really, really easy to start and is very, very lucrative. That's, as a general concept, nature and seeds are just really, really abundant. You put a pepper seed into the ground, and by the end of the season, you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pepper seeds, and vice versa for really everything else. So it's a process that is very lucrative. It makes sense. It's very easy to save seeds. You can look into it more online, and also the process of just being able to have something that represents something and be able to give those to people or trade, and etc. So anybody have any thoughts, any plants that you feel connect with you, that you connect with on a deeper level, that you would want to grow? Ginger, nice. Ginger is a really nice one, and ginger you can do very easily in northern climates too. It is a, a tropical, subtropical thing, but grows really well. It's an annual. You can even use the leaves. I grew ginger one time and it actually bloomed here, really interestingly. And sometimes some of the really easy ways to be growing certain stuff, I've had experience working with like a food pantry sort of thing that had food that was considered like bad, quote unquote, or spoiled. And they gave me a bunch of ginger that was considered not fresh, and it all sprouted. And that season we grew Trader Joe's brand ginger. So sometimes you can find a lot of even planting material from certain things, but ginger is a really great one as a tea. It's definitely one of the plants I think is the epitome of that concept of food and medicine, or food as medicine. So anybody else? Kevin said, you have to purchase plants or seeds every year to then grow. How do you know if the plant you grow will reproduce? Are you referring to like what I said about that one plant, like the herb, or all plants in general? Well, if depending on what I'm growing, my main goal is to preserve and keep seed for whatever I grow. It's usually not really too hard. It's really just about awareness of the plant itself. Obviously, there are certain things that, for instance, I had a pepper somebody brought me from Peru. It's ají amarillo pepper, which is used for spicy sauce. It's really, really great, but it was literally a pepper dried from Peru from a market. So it had only grown there, and there were seeds inside of it. And he said, you can grow this. So what I did was I gave it as long as a season as I could, inside a little warm greenhouse, and I got it to grow as much as it could. But obviously, it's a totally different environment, like time zone, all sorts of stuff. It's below the equator. It was from Peru, and so it wasn't as adapted to this environment and the length of days. So it took a really long time to flower, a really long time to produce fruit, but then finally it did. So that one was an example of something that is not really adjusted here, but something that over time, and especially with folks who are like breeders, who are able to get things to eventually be more established and adapted. But with everything else, I just like to encourage it to go to seed. I save those and I plant them again. Again, everything is really, really abundant. Depending on what exactly it is. Didn't think all plants produce seeds, thanks to Monsanto. Oh yeah, well, depending on, obviously, if you're going for something that has been genetically modified and is considered infertile and won't produce seeds, then yeah, definitely. So you want to be, aware of where exactly you're getting seeds from. But in some of the cases, in most of the cases, like I'll mention the next thing, they will all produce seed. There are some things that don't. One of the things I grew over the years is yucca or cassava. Genetically, it does not really produce seed. It might produce seed, but they're really never viable. So what I do with that is I preserve the cuttings, which is traditionally done by you just cut a piece off of the stem and you plant it in the ground. For me, I would have to cut a piece off from the stem and wait 6 months and then plant it into the ground. So it's a little different. And that's definitely something that comes with trying to cultivate tropical things in the northern climate, but is a little more tricky, but I really like doing that. And then Janisa said, never occurred to me to try and grow culantro. That's definitely something that connects to in my heritage. I've been trying to grow things more traditional to the area, but I think it's important to be growing things that are part of my heritage as well. Yeah, definitely. And that's a good balance also to consider, and observing that the land itself has its own connection and connotation to what is, native to that region, and something that you want to be able to respect and also provide for the land, as a steward, but also being able to connect with the things that make sense to you. Culantro grows really well in the north. I've seen folks grow it all the way up into like Pennsylvania, New York, and it'll go to seed like crazy. And they just take a little while to grow, but if you keep them moist, then yeah, they grow really, really well. Um,
Can I just
oh
insert
yeah,
one little thing? Because there are a lot of questions about seeds and saving seeds, and um, what Brandon said is absolutely true. Like some plants, also like garlic and stuff and potatoes, it's not effective to really plant them from seed, but for those plant and that, it just takes a little bit of research as to what is grown through propagation and what is grown from seed. Something else to consider, this is a really expansive question and topic. So I guess I'll just say also, we are going to have a class on this later in the year. I think it's going to be in August or September, specifically on seed saving, because it is, there's so many like different aspects to it. Emily, you mentioned so true, and that they have open pollinated seeds. So that kind of hints at, not all plants that you grow from seed, like for example, like sunburst tomatoes are a hybrid variety. So that means that they're the next generation, if you were to save the seeds from that, those tomatoes or that crop, they're probably not going to be true to what you originally grew. So there's a lot of complexity there. And I don't want to, go too deep into that because it's like a whole class of its own. But just, yeah, reading the back of your seed packet, really encourage against Monsanto seeds because they're extremely unethical. And like you said, it's literally illegal to save your seeds from Monsanto crop. So yes, look for your local seed companies. So True Seed is awesome. I know Brandon's going to mention a few of them. In the back of those seed packets will have some information. So see if it's heirloom, which means it has been cultivated over generations and it's true to seed, or if it's a hybrid variety, in which case you might not be able to expect that it's going to be true to seed in the next generation, if it's open pollinated or closed. But all those terms have their own meaning, and I would invite you to come to that class to get really into the weeds of that. And that'll be taking place more around the time when we might be saving our seeds. So if you are in this class and joining that class, remember to save your seed packets. And then maybe by the end, you'll say, oh, well, I had these tomatoes that I love. And they'll be ready at that point to actually learn how to save them. And you'll be able to tell from the seed packet if they're savable or not.
nice, cool. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that is important because a lot of seed, everything, I feel like history and like science, and it's just really, really, yeah, diverse. Like potatoes, sweet potatoes, all of these things, yeah, they don't actually start. Seed, quote unquote, is actually just root material, like the actual potato once it sprouts. Same with sweet potatoes. And so you have slips, or you have like buds or whatever that get planted. So it really just depends on the plant. But interestingly, and this is, everyone's different. I like to mess around with stuff sometimes, but things like sweet potato, when they do go to seed and they're pollinated, those seeds then have a totally unique genetic disposition to how they grow. Once you get seed from a sweet potato, you're cultivating a type of sweet potato that is totally random and has never been grown before. And that's how breeding is done. Then they grow something that grows really vibrant leaves, but not as much roots. And then they grow one that has really great roots, but not as much leaves. And then they get, cross-pollinated or whatever. So it's a really interesting science to it. But sometimes I think it's really cool, and I'll like experiment with stuff like that, like variegated type of things, or those seeds of something that are not necessarily creating, like dahlias, for instance. I've used dahlia seeds before, and usually those are just identical because you're using the rhizome and you're planting it again. And then you get dahlias that have never really been grown before because they're totally genetically random, but kind of cool. Maybe not the best for like production in your garden though. And so best way to save seeds, I'll briefly go over it because I know that there's a class on it also after this that in the next class of the series. So I don't want to talk too much into that if they're going to talk about it. But in general, some of your identifiers for saving seeds is that whatever thing that has your seeds, you want to make sure that you are if it's the okra pod, if it's a tomato, whatever, certain things might be very dry. And like with okra, it will literally sound like a rattle. You can shake the seeds inside, they're totally dry. And you would just harvest those. With things like tomatoes, then they're chopped once they're very, very ripe and they're, fully developed. Chop them, mash them up, sieve the tomato seeds out. Some folks also like another use for that or another method for that is they leave them in water to get some of the it helps the germination in the future, and then you dehydrate them or dry them, sun dry them. You can put them on a napkin in the sun. If you're drying something too hot, like with the dehydrator, especially in oven, it's going to be too hot and you'll probably burn up the seed and it might not be able to germinate eventually. But you're just looking for eventually establishing once something, if you have a fruit, it's very, very ripe, you take the seed out and you dry it. That's the general gist of it. And then, yeah, Emily, so true seed, local to Asheville. Their seeds are open pollinated. So you can save the seeds. Super awesome. Jake said, I wanted to start some kale this season. I enjoy its crispness and slight bitter taste. It reminds me when I first started gardening and shared with other fellow gardeners. That's awesome. Yeah, kale is a really great one. You can do that early spring too. That's awesome. And then we said saving seeds from what you grow can be amazing to experiment with because you're growing things that are genetically unique and perhaps adapted to your conditions specifically. Yeah, that's also a really cool thing when like I've traded seeds before. Sometimes it almost felt irrelevant to mention certain details, but I knew like it made sense. Like I was like, I never watered it, or I don't know, something random like that, because they have a genetic uniqueness that's specific to how they were grown, where they were grown, and what exactly was the process. So it's really, really cool. I enjoy stuff like that. What I also enjoy, we can go to the next slide. I hope this is the slide I was thinking of. Oh yeah, it is cool. I do enjoy this. Seed sourcing. So there are plenty of different places to get seeds. For one, I always like to mention this is the packets for True Love Seeds. So True Love Seeds is one of my favorite is my favorite company. They are based in Philly. They are good friends of mine and really awesome people. And their basis, and I feel like it's kind of cropped out, but on the top left it says, um, cultivating and saving seeds is an act of true love for our ancestors and our collective future. It is a practice of freedom. Their concept is that the story is in the seed. So all of their crops, when you look at the story, or you just click on the seed, it's literally just like huge in depth, like this is where it originated from. We got it from this person, whatever. They work with different farmers all over the country, especially in like the Northeast, and they're all cultivating crops that are usually traditional for them. There are certain farmers from different parts of the world who grow their traditional crops and they get their seeds from them. And there's the story behind it, the recipe. They have a podcast that's really great too. I, at one point, before my season, ended up going totally differently. I was supposed to provide them seeds, but they are just really, really amazing people and have a really awesome work going on. So trueloveseeds.com. I don't think it's org. I think .com. But if you look up True Love Seeds, it'll come up. You can see all the stuff they have. A lot of the stuff I've never seen anywhere else. Those culantro recao seeds, you can find them there. You can find a lot of different stuff. Really awesome people. Another one is strictly medicinal. They focus more on medicinal herbs. True Love Seeds does that, but also veggies and foods, so a little bit of both. Strictly medicinal, I know they have both too, but they focus a lot on medicinal herbs. They have a really wide variety of different things. Um, and skipping over the middle two, So True Seed, like someone had mentioned, definitely based in Asheville. Seed Savers Exchange. They are, I forget where they're based, but they have a really great network of different seeds. You can go on their website and see all their stuff and see their catalog. They have a lot of really great stuff. Going back to the middle, two other really great sources for seeds, depending on your involvement with the community projects, community in general. Community projects and centers, a lot of times with community gardens in the area, can have a lot of resources for seeds, seed packets, things that have been saved. Elders, I've met many people and many elders who have tons of different things. They don't really like, actively be like, I have seeds, I have a library, whatever. It's just, what's saved for the next season. And so there's a lot of really cool people that I've met through that process, folks who have, like that one kitchen drawer that's like, it's not for utensils, it just has like random stuff in it. And just one of those full of like envelopes and tip things, seeds, and all sorts of stuff. And so I've met a lot of people with those and a lot of elders who have just a lot of knowledge and information and a lot of really great things that they're open to sharing. So there are plenty of people in your area that are open to sharing these things. It's just about communicating, getting more involved in your community, and seeing what there really is. So, any questions about seed sourcing? And sometimes the internet is a really vast, weird but vast world of being able to access seeds. Etsy is a really interesting source that I found is sometimes works. Sometimes folks are growing stuff like I might grow certain things from the Caribbean, and folks are like, I can send you the plant, like harvested, and I'm like, can you send me just like a frozen or not frozen, like a dried piece of like the flower head or something, and they'll do that, so I'll get seeds. So some places don't necessarily sell seeds, but they have access to the plants fresh. But you can find a lot of stuff on Etsy. I'm not sure what it is about Etsy, but a lot of people get on that and sell seeds and herbs. So really great. And then obviously beyond it all and sourcing them once you have them for your, sourcing from yourself, having your seed library and the things that you've saved over the past seasons in order to cultivate again. And again, you are cultivating a really great and unique sort of genetic background to things when you are saving them yourself and growing them over and over in your specific region. Experimental Farm Network, yes, thank you, has really cool experimental, cool and rare seeds. They're great. There's several public libraries. Yeah, public libraries also a really good resource for that. They might have like a herb thing, or they might also have like a whole library. You can pick different stuff out. But once you also save things for yourself, then you also make it that you can swap. You can do a seed swap in your area. I did a seed swap a couple of years ago, and I got a bunch of people out, and it was a mix of like trading seeds that I had already saved, and also like seed donations with people. And it's really cool because everything has its own story. Like I remember somebody was, I think they were in, they would go down to like Guatemala, and they would work with indigenous folks from that region, and they gave them like a very specific corn that had been grown for generations. And so it's just really cool. People have access to a lot of different stuff that have a wealth of different stories about them. So cool. If we're good on that slide, then we can move to the next one. So seed starting, and again, there is a class in the series, the next class that talks about this. So I'm going to briefly go over this concept without touching too much into it. In general, seed starting, you're looking at getting soil first. So your first step is having soil, but you don't want something that's considered hot. So what hot is that it has a lot of just like active micronutrients. It's very high in organic matter, something like compost, worm castings, like I mentioned. Anything like that is too hot, and seeds sometimes may not even sprout in that. So you want like a seed starting potting soil. You could even mix it with other parts of something as well to help. Um, I need to go back a couple. I do the same thing when I've done this for some reason. It like won't let me go backwards, and so I just have to go to the end of the presentation. No, you're good. So a general rule for seed starting that I consider is looking at double the length of the seed in depth. So if I have a little tomato seed and the length of it is, I don't know, this much, so I might plant it that much. That's a terrible representation because I know it's the camera and stuff, but about double the depth of that, putting it in. You also, again, looking at, if you don't have exact instructions for it on like the package, then you can also look online. There's really good resources that just talk about how something needs to be done. Some things just get scattered on the surface. Some things are really tiny. Like I planted tobacco, and you literally just like stick a little on your finger and sprinkle it over the patch. And then eventually it'll come up. Same with like holy basil or tulsi. Sometimes you really don't need to even put them in like that. You just water them and sprinkle them on the surface, and they do good. So depends on your seed. Look into the actual the instructions you might have gotten from the seed packet. Again, some prefer on the surface, and then you're going to want to consistently water or following the packaging info. Some herbs really don't want that much water as they're starting to grow. And sometimes you can actually overwater things. I've done that before and then stopped, and then for some reason just forgot because I would grow at a scale where I had like 600 trays, and I would just not even think about some of them and be like, weird, that's not coming up. And then it really just needed less water, and once it got dry, it would come up. And so there are some things that take forever. There's like a it's called yerba dulce. It's like it's not actually like a stevia, which sometimes is called yerba dulce in Spanish, but it's like it's a lipia, and it's a ground cover that tastes very sweet and also camphor-like. And it's from mostly like Caribbean, Central American region. And I started it, and it took me like a month and a half before it germinated. I was like, weird. And I ended up looking into it, and that's actually how long it takes. But I just kind of bypassed it in my head, like, okay, like Lipia, because I had grown that type of plant before. But it just took so long. So plants are really unique in their own sense. Just learning about what they specifically like is really great. And then up potting once they're bigger and needing more root roots. So something like this picture, for instance, these little pods might not hold the root growth that is needed for this plant to grow for a long period of time. So you might need to start something. You might need to transfer it into something else. Having this organic material is really great because you don't actually have to dump it out and move it. Some plants are really sensitive to that. Their roots might be sensitive. I've grown moringa, and moringa can be very sensitive to that. So I keep that in mind. Um, in terms of seeds in general, all seeds are different. Some seeds need what is considered cold stratification, so they need the imitation or the process of how they would go through in the wild, which is that they need to go basically through freezing temperatures before they're viable and able to sprout. Sometimes like pawpaws can do that. Another type of seed process for sprouting might be something like scarification, which the seed actually needs to be like scratched with like sandpaper, like a little knife or like butter knife or something in order to open up the outside so that the process can happen better. Um, it really depends on the plant. Moringa sometimes like that, you just crack it and then plant it and then it comes up easier. Hibiscus, any of those mallows sometimes appreciate that scratching on something in order to open it up. Okra as well. And also soaking seeds can be really helpful as well. That helps them sort of bring water into them for a day or two and then plant them. Sometimes peas, okra, stuff like that. Um, and what else? Yeah, that's kind of it. Basic seed starting without going in depth because there's a whole class about this for the next part of the series. So any questions or comments or anything about seed starting? You're definitely going to want to have a good environment where you're able to maintain warmth, which we'll talk about in a sec, and also moisture and humidity so that you're not putting things into a, this is like their baby stage. You want to be able to give them as much care as possible in order to get them up into a more mature stage where they're more stable and then can adapt. When do you expose plant to freezing temperatures? Well, it depends on what you have. So if you're going to be planting something into a freezing temperature and it's tolerant of that, like maybe a brassica, something that's well adapted to that, um, I would let it get like 6 inches tall or so. First, what you have is if you see this picture here, um, you basically have this first shoot, and which I believe is called the cotyledon. Your cotyledon is your basically two leaves that look nothing like the rest. Your first true leaf is going to be the third leaf that comes out. And if that looks like a mustard or a brassica of some sort, if it's kale, that third leaf will look like a leaf of kale. Then the fourth, the fifth, eventually those little tiny leaves will just fall off. So once you get it established, you have 4, 5 full true leaves that are well established. You have a stem that's not leaning over anything, and you have a root system that's well, maybe not in this size, but maybe a little bigger size. Then I would say it's ready to be put out into a temperature that's freezing or pretty cold. But obviously, freezing cold, definitely not ideal if you're growing something like tomatoes or anything like that. You want it to be in a position where you don't necessarily, um, have to be worried about it. And I know that can be sort of all over the place in Charlotte. We've had winters or springs where we weren't able to plant until after Mother's Day. Sometimes it's like April. So it really just depends. It's just, I think, about being in touch with the weather and looking at what exactly the forecast is. Are you going to hit another frost? And also looking at the median and just understanding. But what you could also do with your starts and your seeds is sometimes you can get them to adapt slowly. If you are growing them inside of an indoor thing, you can take them out and leave them outside in the daytime and then bring them back in the nighttime. And through that process, they're getting a little more adapted day by day into colder weather until you end up putting them in the ground directly. So you just don't want to have them so warm and then immediately into the ground and they're shocked at how different the temperature is. And then they might have an issue with their roots or they might even die. So, cool. I'm gonna check the chat, make sure. Nice, yeah. Cool, so we can switch to the next one if there's no more questions about that. So warm indoor space, this is definitely something that a lot of people ask about. There are a lot of different options that you can do. It doesn't have to be a fancy looking nice, that's really nice, little greenhouse like that you build. If you have a warm area near you, you can always do that, especially indoors. If you have a heater or heated area that collects more heat than most, a windowsill. You can also buy lights sometimes. I don't know specifications on like type of lights or how many like watts or anything. But if you just get one and kind of hang it up over something, maybe just prop it up and can put like I've seen people use, and I personally use like eggshell or like egg containers, and you can just put them. I've seen them do the eggshell thing too, but I was like, I don't know, let's just put it in the egg container. So like a dozen of eggs, and you have that bottom part with where the eggs actually go. You fill that with soil, then you put your seeds there. That material is also compostable, so you can just plant it directly into the soil when you do, or you could just put it into a bigger container as you transplant it up. So that's something you consider by the windowsill or with a little light above it. Um, an outdoor space like this does not need to be heated because all of that material is going to conduct heat and make it a lot warmer inside, even when it is cold outside. But you just want to be observant of that and understand and make sure that even when it's really cold, though it is insulated in whatever way or built this way, that it doesn't get freezing cold inside. Can you cover that door up? Is it something that you can add something to add more heat? Can you insulate the side of it? Um, so, just things to consider. Near heater was the third one, not Hester. I'm not sure what a Hester is. Homemade greenhouse. If you are up for a project and you have the resources, you could always make a homemade one. I've never had projects like that before, but there's some definitely really great what's the word, not a recipe, like plans and things online that you can find that show the materials that you need at like a really affordable price as long as you can put it together yourself. And again, putting it outside and not heating it directly in a greenhouse, you're using the heat of the sun and the insulation outside. So more material you can add for insulation, and also the more heat you can conduct into an environment where you're not necessarily needing um, actual heat, then most ideal. And also considering that when you're starting seeds, depending on what you're starting, you don't need to start it way, way in advance. It's definitely good to, but at some point it might be really starting to slowly get less cold. I mean, it really just depends on when your season starts. Like, I feel like I have a distortion of that now because I'm upstate. I'm in upstate New York right now, and it's like 2 degrees outside. So my interpretation of when it starts to get somewhat warmer is a little different. But I know in the Carolinas, especially, usually about February, there's somewhat of a difference. But if you're starting things indoors, you really want to avoid them being out because sometimes it still like snows, there's still ice, it gets definitely below freezing on a regular basis. So just wanting to be mindful of that if you are doing something that is outside. Cool. Any questions, anything, thoughts about indoor space? I know it's definitely not like a direct answer because I don't have tons of experience with that, but the best thing that I've seen is folks definitely using their indoor heat, a heater or something in the small spaces that they have, and maybe even lights in order to create something that's greenhouse-like. So, cool. So we can switch over. Oh wait, no, I got a question. Kevin said, "Can you grow in a greenhouse all year by covering it?" As long as you can maintain a good temperature, the only issue is if you're covering it, you really got to be able to cover it and keep that heat out. But when you do that, and if it's midsummer, it still might accumulate a lot of heat. Any of those inside things, even if you cover it, it just might have a hard time because then you're going to want to put lights in there. And I guess you're working on like the ambient heat that's generated in general because you're covering it. So yeah, have to like vent in the summer if you had something in the back to get airflow through it. That way it's not just like cooking in there because it will get really hot in those little things. I've had been working in something like that before, and it was sweltering. It was very hot, and the plants just it doesn't take long for them, just like in a cold or like a frozen sort of spell. In that heat, it does not take long for them to get overwhelmed, and a day or two later, they're dead. So just keeping that in mind. Cool. So we switch to the next slide. So transplanting. This is a good, somewhat good representation in the photo next to it. This is probably 2-3 inches tall, whatever it is specifically. And one thing that you want to consider, oh here, let me answer this. Kevin say, can you grow in the winter with the greenhouse to have vegetables all year? Yeah, folks will do that, but you just want to make sure that you're getting ample light, like sunlight. One of the things about growing in a greenhouse over the winter, some people just do hoop houses. So a hoop house is basically somewhat of the same thing. It's just blocking too much of that wind from really coming through, and it's also keeping that intense sun because even in the winter you can get a lot of sun, but that might sort of instigate your plants to bolt, like I was saying, which is basically to flower and bloom and go to seed, which is going to take not only your flavor away, but it's going to finish the plant's life cycle. So hoop houses are really nice. They don't take a bunch of material to end up building them, just like cloth. You could do in a greenhouse over the winter, but your only thing would be just considering the heat that is generated in there because it can get pretty warm in the winter time. And so if your plants are not super adapted to that and they're also trying to deal with freezing temperatures, then it might be kind of back and forth. So with transplanting, again, you want to consider that your plant is well established, which is, I say a few inches tall, but I would say a few inches like this, I would consider putting up into something else. That root growth is probably all throughout that little square. So you want to give it something maybe the size of like 4 of those squares, like a little container, and then putting it into that, having some whatchamacallit, some resources, some extra soil for doing that. And let me see. Yeah, sorry. And I'm also, yeah, realizing it's 6:50. So I'm gonna start to wrap it up and go through this. You can always move them to bigger pots if needed. And in general, you want to put it in again 6 inches or so once it's well established, has a good amount of true leaves. This still doesn't really have that, so you want it to be more established. After your last chance of frost and about 6 to 8 inches tall or so, oh, 6 to 8 inches, y'all, tall, I meant. I guess my phone thinks that I'm still in the South. Y'all, they can grow into the ground directly. So that is just one thing to consider, that you want your stuff to be well established before you put it in, and that you don't have to worry about your plants being too tender for that. So yeah, so we have 10 minutes left. I want to see how y'all are feeling. Do you all feel like you have questions? I want to do maybe like Q&A in specific situations. I'm not remembering exactly how many slides are left here, but I just wanted there to be an emphasis on you all reflecting and thinking about the specific things, concerns, and ideas and worries that you might have with your home gardens, and utilizing, me here now as a resource for you if you want to bounce any of these thoughts or ideas off of and think about some things. So let's see. So I'm getting questions. I'm trying to remember how many slides are left in this because I'm not presenting it. So I'm just trying to see. But we will start with some of the questions. So Emily asked,
We only
approximately
had
how
like
long should you
2.
harden off? Oh, sorry. Was someone saying something?
Yeah, I was just saying we only had these 2 slides left. But if you wanna maybe like cover them quickly and then we can go to questions. And folks, if you want to start putting your questions in the chat, feel free. And we are recording all of this. So if you want to come back and revisit any of the slides, you'll be able to after as well.
Cool. Yeah, let's do that. So maybe this is the next slide? We can just start with this.
Yeah, this was the next one.
So another concept of this, I guess grow up would have been maybe if I put an exclamation point, it would be a little more fun, just a little strict, grow up. Another concept of growing in general is that you can utilize the space that you have. And Emily, I'm gonna get back to your question just a second once you finish these two. Um, Growing upwards allows us more space using trellises, like these really cool honeycomb trellises that they have. Is a really great idea for that. Um, Other methods of taking vining plants and helping maximize cultivation space. Some ideas of some of these vining plants might be things like beans, cucumbers, vining flowers, vining herbs, also any of those curcubits. So cucumbers, you have cucumbers themselves, you have bitter melons that vine. I've seen people vine and like trellis up watermelon, but it just depends because those things get heavy and then it starts to really mess with the vine actually establishing itself. So that's just some thoughts, options, gourds, things like that is one thing for sure. And yeah, so that's just a general thing. Think about your space because you do have space above as well, aside from just spreading out. And then we'll go to the next slide, I believe about our last slide. And just regular care. We've talked a lot about the general care that we need to, the things that we need to observe in our gardens. Watering regularly if needed, if we are wanting to, as we talked a little bit about, build some resilience. If they need water, we understand when they really need it. If they don't need it and we haven't watered them, then letting that go along to let them build up that resilience to heat and to not needing water as regularly. Pruning. This is, for instance, when we have stuff like basil, right? Basil might have its new growth and it comes up to its final point of where it's growing. All those mint family plants are going to, one really good thing you can do is just pick it right above the next node of the next leaves. And when you do that, you're encouraging growth to bush out to the side. So you have two shoots going out to the side. You're basically developing like a bushing out structure of everything to be more expansive in the form that it grows, and also to top it off and not send energy directly up. So you have a really tall, non-supported plant, but you're bushing it up so it's well supported. Harvesting, I mean, that's why it's there. Sometimes I grow stuff and I'm like, I don't even want to harvest it. I just want to see it. But it's really good to harvest. Picking it in the sense of, again, topping it off like that, giving it a good trim. Some things you might have multiple harvests of over the season. Sometimes you're just waiting for the end to harvest the roots. Pulling may not be growing well. It's one thing to be able to identify when a plant is really just not going to make it. It's not growing anymore. At this point, it's just taking up space and it's just struggling. Sometimes you can just, believe in it, have faith, and then, doctor it up and it'll grow. Sometimes they just won't survive the transplanting process. You just want to be aware of when at that point it's just like a little spot that you could plant something else in, or you could just leave it. And but just being aware and observing what might not be having the best time and what some of the treatments are, because sometimes you are having something like a mildew and you don't want that to spread to other parts of the garden. And then with regular care also comes weeding, which I give in quotes because weed is, obviously a subjective thing. Weeds tend to a lot of times be food and medicine. So I think of it also as just more fun to look around in the area and also see what is harvestable and used for food. Plenty of stuff like dandelion and plantains and purslane and all of these things are really great that you can use in order to make more food, make more medicine. So yeah, that's kind of that's regular care. That's the end of that. And then we'll go to the last slide and I'll start to look at questions too, as we also talk about what the last slide says. Oh, that was it. Oh yeah, the consider. So let me see.
I'm gonna just stop my share and we can just go to camera. I'll turn mine on.
Cool.
Also talk to each other. Folks have questions. I know there were a few in the chat. So
Yeah. Cool. So I know one of them was from Emily. Approximately how long should you harden off plants before putting it in the ground? 2 weeks, a month? Honestly, I would give it just a couple of weeks of doing that, like every day or every couple of days. That way you're at least getting it used to that. Ideally, the environment that it's in as you are doing that is not going to be what you're planting into. For instance, if you are taking it out and putting it in 40-degree weather. After doing that for 3 or 4 weeks, if it's getting warmer, you may not be putting it into that weather anymore. It might be in the 50s or something. But you just want to give it an experience of what it is like in that colder region. That way you don't shock it so much. So I would say a couple weeks. If you do a month, then that's fine, but you just want to make sure your plants are established a couple inches. You don't want to put new sprouts out because you risk it being so sensitive that it just dies, but not enough to be ready to go into the ground, but enough to need to experience a difference in climate. So can you recommend a reference for choosing plants that work well together? Like the three sister concept, vegetables, herbs. I think of it in a visual sense. And I think also it's really great to incorporate aromatic herbs in general into a lot of your gardens, because a lot of things, especially the marigold family, can play pest control and also attract a lot of beneficial pollinators. An example of that obviously is marigolds. There is a Peruvian herb that I grow very often called huacatay that does really good for that too. It smells amazing, gets very tall and bushy, comes back every year, and it's also really great for any pests in the roots. And yeah, in the group chat was just sent the Almanac Companion Planting and Guide Vegetables is also a really good resource for that, to understand what exactly grows well with each other, because the situations are always really unique. And if that's it for questions, then I guess if you want to finish up, because I know someone was asking about the class on the 5th, that way y'all can get that information. And thank you so much, everybody, for being here.
Thank you so much, Brandon. I really appreciate all the knowledge you've shared today. So thanks, and thanks for kicking off the first class of the year. I'll talk a little bit, and if there's any other questions that come up, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm also going to share our evaluation link in the chat, so if you could take a couple minutes, it's really going to take like 2 minutes to do this evaluation. Let us know how we did, what we could do better in the future. No, my link is not there anymore. We do really take evaluation seriously at OGS and try to incorporate the feedback, and because there are future classes happening in this series, it could even make a difference for the next class year. And so there it is. And I'll also send it out by email for those of you who don't have time right now. So I think so the next class is not actually taking place on March 5th. The next class is going to be on February 12th. So the structure of this series is we're going to have one class every month. We are trying to figure out how much we can do hybrid, online, and in person right now, just because with the COVID numbers going up, we want to make sure it's accessible to anyone who wants to join, even if they don't feel comfortable coming in person. So the next class is going to be hybrid. It's going to be on starting seeds with Hannah Gibbons, who actually works at So True Seed, which is one of the seed companies we mentioned. And that's going to be taking place at Smith Millworks in Asheville. So that's where the OGS office is located. And actually this year, for the first time, we are renting out one of the large greenhouse spaces, and we'll be holding classes in there throughout the year. So it's a really well ventilated and open space that we hope will be warm in the winter and also a little more COVID safe and comfortable. And it's in West Asheville. But yeah, for anybody who is signed up, I'll be sending out more details on that and exactly where to find us and where to park and stuff. Yeah, the March 5th class is going to be the March class. It's going to be more on tool selection and what different tools are useful for the home garden. That's going to be with Keenan Phillips, who is the education director over at the Asheville Tool Library, for those of you who are familiar. And that's also going to be taking place at Smith Millworks in that greenhouse. So yeah, I didn't post the address on the website, but I will be sending out the exact details to folks who are registering. Awesome. Yeah, and please feel free to email us at any point. I'm gonna stop recording now.